Touring the Visio 2010 interface. Now that we know what Visio is, what it's used for, and how it is situated in the Microsoft Office product family, we're going to fire up the application itself and get comfortable with its user interface, or UI. If you're coming to Visio 2010 brand new without having used a previous version, then the movement to the backstage view and the ribbon probably won't be as shocking as it is for those of us who have experience with prior Visio versions. After we cover the user interface and how to get around in Visio, we'll cover file types. There are some technical details that we need to understand in terms of what file types make up a Visio drawing, how do templates work, how do stencils and shapes fit into the picture. This is going to give us some much needed vocabulary. Finally, we'll do some brief work on exporting out of Visio 2010. In other words, the idea is you've spent quite a bit of time and effort building a drawing in Visio. We don't want to have to require that the recipient of our Visio files also has Visio installed on their system, because in my experience, many times that's not the case. So we'll look at saving Visio drawings under different file types, and we'll also cover the Visio Viewer ActiveX plugin and a little bit on SharePoint Visio services. We're going to do a more formal treatment of SharePoint later in the course, but these latter options allow us to render Visio drawings just by using an ordinary web browser. Without any further ado, let's get working. In this demonstration, we're going to spend time touring and getting comfortable with the Visio 2010 interface. The first question is, after we've installed the software, what are the mechanisms for starting up the application? I don't mean to insult your intelligence here, I just want the training to be as wide spectrum as possible. Although I'm focusing my audience on the IT professional, I understand at the same time that not everybody is coming into the IT field with loads of end user experience. So bear with me here. The first way to start up Visio is through the Start menu hierarchy. As previously discussed, the Visio application gets installed by default in the Microsoft Office program group, and there's the shortcut right there. Another mechanism for starting up Visio is from the command line or the run box in Windows. There we can type the executable program name for Visio, which happens to be just Visio, V-I-S-I-O. That's a really fast way to start the application. The third way is to double left click a file that's associated with Microsoft Visio. And you see I have a sample file on my desktop that I've called Nugget Lab ERD. This is an entity relationship diagram, in other words, a database schema diagram that I created for another CBT Nuggets training series. Now I want you to see that the file extension for a Visio drawing is VSD. This is an interesting departure. When Microsoft released the Office 2007 suite, and some of you I'm sure know this, they also changed the file formats and file structures significantly for those files. For instance, instead of the .doc Microsoft Word file that we had with Office 2003 and earlier, Word 2007 and Word 2010 use the file format docx, D-O-C-X. Interestingly, the Visio file format, at least in terms of its extension, is the same as it's always been for many years, VSD. At any rate, I'm going to open up the run prompt, type Visio, and let's fire up the Visio application. When you start Visio 2010, it'll always open by default into what's called the backstage view. In Office 2007, you had the Getting Started page, which was a precursor to Backstage View. This Backstage View is part of all of the Office 2010 applications now, so get used to it. And essentially what Backstage View is an expanded file menu. You notice here up in our navigation structure we have a highlight, a dark blue highlight around File. First thing you should notice is that you can navigate the ribbon interface, first of all by clicking each ribbon tab. More on the additional ribbon tabs in just a moment, but for now let's stay focused on Backstage View. Whereas in the traditional Windows applications that have a menu and toolbar system, the file menu ordinarily controls your file level management commands. Things like new document, save, open, print, and that's the case with the Backstage View. You notice here that in this menu we do in fact have save, save as, open and close. We can look at document info. Recent enables us to browse recently opened files. New is where we'd go to build a new Visio drawing. print, save and send, help options, and exit. Now you might be wondering, why are many of these options grayed out? For instance, save, save as, and close. The answer to that is we do not have a document open yet. Once we do open a document, all of these options will become active. For instance, let me click open here, and in the open dialog box, I'll browse out to my desktop and I'll select my Nugget Lab ERD drawing. Now you notice that the open button, we can just click it all day long to open the file in a read-write fashion, but the open button also has a drop-down arrow where you can open as copy and open read-only. You'd open as copy if, for instance, another person had the file open and you didn't want to run into any conflicts that way. You'd choose open read-only if you wanted to ensure that you didn't accidentally change any of the contents of your drawing. You just wanted to show it, for instance. I'm going to choose the default option to open the file straight away. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a database entity relationship diagram for another CBT Nuggets course. Specifically, I used this database and this ERD document in my training series on Access 2010, so you might want to check that out if you have any interest. But basically, as I said, once you have a file open, you'll note that we have all of our Backstage View options activated, the Info tab where we can reduce or remove personal information, reduce the file size. Another one that we didn't have available to us when we didn't have a document open was the print, where we can access print options, save and send, which is where we go to do publishing to SharePoint, changing the file type. More on all that stuff later. And then, perhaps most importantly, we have the options button that brings up the Visio options dialog box. This is where we can control how Visio behaves on our system, and we're going to be visiting this dialog box quite a bit throughout the training to make tweaks here and there. Another aspect of the interface I want to introduce you to, besides the Backstage View, is the online help, which exists over here on the ribbon tab. See the little question mark with the button around it? If you give that a click, that opens up the Visio help interface. I want you to know Microsoft has done a lot of good work, and they tend to spend quite a bit of time documenting their software, so it would be worth your while, I believe, for you to make use of Visio help whenever you have a question and you need to know how to do a particular task. You'll note that the Visio help is contextual. That is, because we're in Backstage View when I clicked the help button, it brought us to the article What and Where is Backstage View. You can always return to the home page of the Visio documentation to go to the root of the hierarchy, and of course we can always search for articles by using the search box. Now I want to make you aware of something really important with Visio help. Notice in the lower right corner of the help dialog box, on my machine it says offline. Let me open that up. What you can do with Visio help, and again this pertains to all of your Office 2010 applications, is that you can use either local help, in other words all of the help that exists on your local computer that was installed with Visio itself, or you can choose show content from office.com. If you do have an internet connection, I'd strongly recommend that you choose that option to show content from Office. That creates an internet-based umbilical cord between your computer and Microsoft, but you'll have the benefit of getting much richer search results. You'll get not only text-based instructions, but you can get movie files and audio files as well as downloads, and you also benefit from having the help files being really up to the minute. So for instance, let's say I wanted to understand how to remove a guide from a drawing. I could just run a free search, free text search, and you get results just like you would from any search engine. You note that the help search engine is powered by Bing, Microsoft's own search technology. You can refine your search however you want. For instance, I just used the term guides, and the first result says use guides to lay out a drawing. That might give me exactly what I need here. And these articles are all making use of HTML. This one is a very simple article, but many of them, as I said, especially if you're connected to office.com, will have movie files and a really rich multimedia interface. So that's just a very basic primer on using online help. Now, let's look at other navigation elements on the screen. In the very upper left corner, you'll see what's called the Quick Access Toolbar. This becomes active when we're in the main view rather than the Backstage View. And the purpose of this Quick Access Toolbar is to give you, the user, your frequently used commands, and they stay static throughout the lifetime of the application. You have to remember that Visio 2010, like the other members of the Office 2010 suites, is a very context-sensitive application. What this context context sensitivity means is that depending upon what object we're working in Visio, Visio may spawn additional ribbon tabs that focus on that specific aspect. And let me take an example. Why don't we insert a piece of clip art really quickly? I'll do a search for student, and I'll just drag a stock photo into the image. And I'll resize it by clicking and dragging a corner handle. Of course, it doesn't fit in with our ERD diagram, but that's okay. Now you'll notice that as long as that picture is selected, we have an additional ribbon tab called Picture Tools that shows up, and that ribbon tab has a sub-tab called Format, and this gives us all of our commands that deal with editing and customizing a graphic image, a picture. When we left-click our mouse on the drawing surface, in other words, not select that picture, the context-sensitive ribbon tab goes away. I'm going to close the Clip Art Tasks pane to give us a little bit more screen real estate. So the bottom line, friends, just to give you the formal introduction, is that Microsoft thought that the menu and toolbar system was just too antiquated and cumbersome. So their user interface experts came up with this ribbon schema. And yes, it takes a little bit of getting used to initially, but I think over time you'll find it more intuitive than the old way of doing things. Basically, you have grouped categories of tasks. The Home tab is meant to give you your most frequently accessed commands globally in the application. The Insert tab intuitively leads us to commands that involve, as I just showed you, inserting an illustration in, inserting a callout, a hyperlink, a text box, etc. The Design tab is where we change the look and feel of our Visio drawing. It's where we can change margins, page size, paper orientation. We can apply a global color theme, customize foreground and background and layout. The Data tab is going to give us access to external data as long as we're using an appropriate edition of Visio. Process deals with process diagrams and SharePoint workflow. Again, this is a high-end Visio feature that's not available in all editions. Review tab gives us all of our collaboration tools in one ribbon. View is where we go when we want to edit how we're viewing and what we're viewing on the screen. And then Database, again, this is a high-end feature that deals with external data. So again, the notion is you think to yourself what you want to do. For instance, I want to insert a hyperlink on my page. I remember that we want to insert, go to the Insert Ribbon tab, and then there's our command. You'll note that each ribbon is broken down into what are called groups. Again, the idea is to aggregate commands that are of similar function to make it easier for you to understand what's going on. And to break it down even more than that, you'll notice that some ribbon groups have a little icon in their lower right. It's an arrow with a right angle. Formally, what that is, it's called a dialog box launcher. Because, for instance, and you should know this if you have any experience working with Microsoft Office, there are far more options for customizing font than just what you see here in this ribbon group. To access all of the options for that category, if there is a dialog box launcher, you'll see the icon, and if you give it a left click, Visio will invoke the appropriate dialog box. So in this case, clicking the Font dialog box launcher opens the text dialog box and focuses on us on the font page. If we come over to Paragraph and click the dialog box launcher, it again opens the same dialog box but just brings the appropriate page to the foreground. So at this point we've covered the ribbon, I think, pretty thoroughly. The final things I want to say about the ribbon before we move on are, again, a context-sensitive help system. You'll notice that when you hover your mouse over a toolbar button, or should I say a ribbon tool button, you'll get a pop-up bit of help text. Now, what that pop-up text is called, again, I'm getting really geeky here on you, is not a tooltip, but a screen tip. In earlier versions of Office, in particular Office 2003 and earlier, you could hover over a button and the only tip you'd get is a little tooltip that gave you the name of the command. Here you notice that screen tips are much more robust. They actually consist of 3 sections: header, body, and footer. So you can pack a lot more information into a screen tip than you could with the old school tooltips. You can actually include rich formatted text and graphics as you see in this particular screen tip. So definitely make use of screen tip helps. As I said, you get that for most anything in the Visio interface, including, as you see here, the shapes, at least the built-in shapes in the product. Final thing about the ribbon is it does take up a fair amount of screen real estate. I hope that you're on a monitor that has a fairly high resolution, so it's not going to be that big of an issue. but you can always reduce the clutter that you see by minimizing the ribbon. And we can minimize the ribbon a couple different ways. We can double left click a ribbon tab. That minimizes the ribbon such that if you click a ribbon tab once, it exposes the ribbon, and then once you make a choice from the menu and click again, the ribbon disappears. So again, click the ribbon tab, make your selection, and then the ribbon collapses again. You can double left click any ribbon tab to bring the ribbon out permanently where it stays up. You can't incrementally resize the ribbon. It's either minimized or maximized. It's one of two states. The other way to minimize or maximize the ribbon is to right click anywhere on the ribbon, and you'll see we have an option for minimizing the ribbon, and if we right click again, you can uncheck minimize the ribbon to bring it back. We have traditional Windows controls in the upper right. You have your minimize, window restore, and close buttons. The thing I always tell folks who are new or newer to Microsoft Office applications is to be careful which of these close buttons you're closing. The inner close button deals with closing the document or closing the window more formally. I won't save changes. The outer X will close the entire Visio application, so be careful on how that works. I'm going to double left click Visio ERD to open Visio with the file preloaded. Cool. So I've covered the quick access toolbar. This gives frequently used commands that are visible no matter where you are in the interface. Notice that it doesn't matter which ribbon tab we go to. These quick access commands are still there. Now you can open the little drop down to get some other pre-assigned options. For instance, if you use new a lot, you can add that command to the quick access toolbar. Let's say we want open as well, and do that all day long. You can also choose more commands to customize the quick access toolbar. We'll be dealing with that later in the course. This is just a general introduction. This little arrow here, I forgot about this, to the left of the help button is yet a third way to minimize the ribbon. I personally double left click to turn the minimization on or off, but your mileage may vary. Now to come into the main body of the screen, you'll notice that Visio 2010 is divided into two panes. You have what's called the Shapes window, or the Shapes pane on the left, and then you have your Drawing window on the right. The Shapes pane is really important because this gives us access to all of our Visio stencils. A Visio stencil in turn is a collection of shapes. So we have one Shapes window that consists of one or more stencils. A stencil is a collection of individual shapes, and then shapes are the atomic unit that you use to build your Visio drawings. Now globally you can expand or contract your Shapes window by coming to the split bar between the Drawing window and the Shapes window until you get a double-headed arrow, and then just drag with your mouse. What I'll do a lot of times, just to tuck the Shapes window out of sight almost, is use this guy up here, the minimize the Shapes window button. If you give that one click, it'll take the Shapes window all the way over to the left to give you just your top 4 shapes in the current stencil, and it gives you access to your Shapes menu as well. But this is a really good shortcut to know, because oftentimes you won't need any new shapes for the moment, and you want to give as much screen real estate to your drawing as possible. You can double left click the ribbon to really give yourself some room to move. Now you notice that the ruler is visible here. This is an option that can be turned on or off in the Visio options dialog box, and the units that are used for the ruler, either metric or imperial, that's going to depend upon A, the version of Visio that you're using, whether it's localized for the US or a European country, let's say, and it also is going to be determined in the template that you choose. More on that in just a moment. We can use the ruler to physically lay out objects on the drawing, as well as to bring out guides, which are excellent ways to keep your objects in your drawings lined up. More on guides, much more later in the course. Now I mentioned that the Shapes window and the Shape stencils are our building blocks for our Visio drawings. You should know, and we're going to get into this in great detail as we move through the course, that each stencil is an actual file in the file system. A stencil is a file with an extension of VSS. Remember that the Visio drawings is VSD. It should be easy to remember. VS stands for Visio and D stands for drawing or diagram. diagram. Stencil files are VSS files, VS for Visio and S for stencil. And you have infinite flexibility just about with regard to these stencils. You can build your own custom stencils that aggregate shapes that fit your project types. You can move shapes from stencil to stencil. We have lots and lots of opportunities here to move. Another aspect of the Visio template, besides the drawing scale, drawing units, and ruler visibility, and the main thing really that differentiates Visio templates, is the number and type of stencils that are available. Speaking of templates, why don't we close out of the current diagram and let's discuss how to create and save Visio files using templates. If we come back to the Backstage view, down to the New option, this dialog box allows us to build a brand new Visio file. A new Visio file is always going to be reliant upon a template. And again, a template is a predefined collection of stencils, drawing units, drawing scale. It's basically a canned Visio environment that you then use as a starter for building that type of drawing. Templates save you a lot of time because otherwise you would have to, if you did a blank drawing for instance, you would have to build your drawing from scratch by manually loading your relevant stencils, changing your drawing scale and units and all of that. Not fun at all. The much preferred way to build Visio drawings is to use a template, and yes, you can create your own. The way this template picker works in the Backstage view, we can always go back to the template home page by using this home button, and you'll notice the backward and forward buttons, they work very much like a web browser. You note that we start off with recently used templates. This is going to be empty the very first time you start Visio after it's freshly installed, but once you start building drawings, you're going to find that your recently used templates show up in this list. In template categories, this is going to depend, the number of these is going to depend upon which edition of Visio you're working in. If you have the premium edition like I do, you'll have all of the built-in template categories. And basically it's like this. You left-click one of the categories to take a look at the specific templates within that category. You'll note that our navigation here uses a breadcrumb motif where now it shows that we're in the flowchart sub area of the template homepage. And these are specific templates. Visio team has done a great job of defining what these mean. For instance, if I select BPMN diagram, we see on the right a larger thumbnail of what that type of diagram looks like, and it gives us a little blurb in terms of what kind of drawing we're going to be expected to do. I'm going to select basic flowchart here, and before we click create, we can select our units. Now I'm defaulting to US units because I'm using a US localized version of Visio. If I wanted to override that and use metric units, I can select metric units and then click create. I'm going to keep it on US on my system. Now to create the document itself, I can either click create or you can actually double left click the icon if you want to go about it in a slightly faster way. As soon as you bring up your new drawing, I would recommend you save. We always want to save. Save early, save often. If you've ever been burned by losing work because you haven't saved frequently enough, you can get into that habit pretty quickly of saving religiously like I do. We can hit Control S on the keyboard or use the Save button on the Quick Access toolbar to save this drawing. Note that the type is VSD, no big surprise there. I'm going to call this My Flowchart and save it to my desktop. So instead of just drawing one, the default name for the file, we now have the actual file name show up in the Visio title bar. You also see a collection of stencils in our Shapes window. For the basic flowchart, we get a basic flowchart shapes stencil as well as a cross-functional flowchart shape stencil. Now note that you can click the stencil header to bring the stencil to the forefront. You notice also that we have a stencil called Quick Shapes. What this is a subset of shapes from the other stencils in that template that Microsoft feels will be most frequently used by the user. I mean, some of these stencils, friends, include lots and lots of shapes, dozens of shapes. So I think it's really helpful that Microsoft always gives us a template-specific quick shape stencil from which we can choose the most common objects. I mean, if you've done any flowcharts, I think you would agree with me and Microsoft that these 6 shapes are by far the most common ones when you're building a flowchart document. If you do want to load additional stencils or shapes, we also have the More Shapes menu. We're going to be using this a lot throughout the course, where you can do a search, keyword search for shapes. We can go and get shapes online. My Shapes, which is your own personal favorites stencil, again more on that later, and then we have access to all of the VSS files that are resident on this computer. They're divided by category, and then you go into the appropriate category and then select a specific stencil. You'll note that we have in the flowchart area a lot of options here. Let me choose Department US Units for grins, and sure enough it shows up with all of the other stencils. We can scroll through and make use of those shapes all day long. If we determine that this is not the correct stencil, we can close it by right-clicking the stencil and selecting Close. Note also when we right-click a stencil header, there are a few other interesting options. You can change the view. The default is icons and names, and I tend to like that, but you can also choose names under icons if you like, or icons only, or names only, or icons and details if you really want Visio to hold your hand. I'm going to reset the view to the default icons and names option. Note also we can right-click, choose float window, and what this will do, we can also just drag it out. We don't have to choose float window necessarily. Notice I just did that. This gives you a floating palette similar to how the Adobe applications work if you have experience using those, and you can run these into any side of the screen, particularly the left and right side, to dock them that way, and then again just drag out and let it go. I'm going to redock to the Shapes window. Just know that it's eminently possible to move these around. Your Shapes window is traditionally docked to the left side of the screen, but it does not have to be that way specifically. Final point I want to make preliminarily about these is you can rearrange the order of your stencils simply by dragging and dropping. That's what I'm doing. I'm dragging the basic flowchart shapes above and below the cross-functional option. You can totally customize how this works. And just to prove that these are in fact VSS files, note I can right-click a stencil and choose Save As to save a copy of a stencil. When you do that, Visio puts all of your custom stencils under the Documents folder of your system in a subfolder called My Shapes. The favorite stencil is always there. That's just your built-in user favorite stencil, and sure enough, I'm showing my file extension so I can see the VSS there. And if I want to save a copy of this flowchart shape stencil, I can do that, give it a unique name, and it gets saved as a VSS stencil file as well. Good, so much for this particular template. Let's close out and come backstage again, and just to click through some of these template categories just to show you what's here. Tremendous amount of flexibility. We have cause and effect diagrams, ITIL diagrams, fault tree analysis diagrams, organizational chart templates, Six Sigma. Note that I'm clicking home to come back to the home page. General is just your basic block diagram types. Maps and floor plans. This is good for facilities managers and architects. You can do some really accurate scale drawings of building interiors and exteriors. The network template is particularly important to Windows Active Directory administrators. You notice we do have an Active Directory template built in. Basic and detailed network topology diagrams. If you're not necessarily an Active Directory administrator, but say maybe a Mac OS Open Directory administrator or using NetWare or whatever, you have an LDAP template for LDAP directory services. And then we have rack diagram. Very, very cool thing to do to map your server rooms and telco closets. Come back home, and so on down the line. I would encourage you to spend time clicking through those template categories and getting familiar with what's there. I also want to make you aware of down at the very bottom, other ways to get started. You can in fact invoke an absolutely blank drawing if you want to, but this is more for advanced users who want to, say, build a template where you're building the document from absolutely scratch. And then once you're finished loading stencils, let's say, that are relevant for your purposes, you've changed the drawing scale, you've changed the page orientation. I'll change mine to landscape, for instance. I'll change the page size to tabloid. Once you've finished all that, you can save the file as a reusable template by coming backstage, coming to Save As, and then instead of saving it as just drawing VSD, you'd instead save it as, you give it a name, and then open up the Save As type, and you notice that we have under Stencil, we have a VST file format. This is a template file format, and thus we can build documents based on our new template whenever we want to. Now I saved my template to the desktop instead of my template location. We'll talk more about templates later in the course, so I'm going to let that go right now. And instead, from the backstage recent area, I'm going to select Nugget Lab ERD because I want to finish out this tour by showing you the status bar area and then finally how we can export to different file types and display Visio drawings drawings in the browser. Let me minimize the Shapes window to give the drawing pane focus. And you note here that we have the document window itself, and then we have this blank stuff behind it. This blank stuff that surrounds your drawing surface is called the pasteboard, and this is a non-printing area that can be a really helpful place to stage assets that you'll use in the future but maybe not right now. So for instance, I've dragged out a couple shapes from my stencil. They're not going to be printed, but I can keep them staged, like I said, for future use. Good thing to know about the pasteboard. Down at the bottom of the screen, if you've used Microsoft Excel or Access, you should be familiar with this. Notice that I can drag the split bar to give myself more visibility. A Visio drawing file can consist of one or more pages, and those pages in turn can be foreground and or background pages. This ERD diagram consists of page 1 that contains the actual drawing, and VBackground1 is the default name for a background page. We'll learn how to dress up drawings in the next nugget by using background pages. You can spawn additional pages by using the Insert button. By default, those new pages will take on the background if you've applied one. I'm going to right-click the new page and select Page Setup from the shortcut menu, and on the Page Properties tab, I'm going to disassociate that background page with this page because I want to show you that when you start a Visio drawing, by default, that page is divided just like graph paper basically into divisions, and the scale that the division uses depends upon your page setup options like we'll talk about later in the course. You can have as many pages as you want in a Visio drawing, and as we're going to see later in the course, you can actually create links on one Visio page that take the viewer to a spot on another Visio page. Really nice way to do business. You'll notice also that we can use this scrubber here just like we can in any Windows application to move around. There's some fantastic keyboard shortcuts that I'll be teaching you throughout the course, both keyboard and mouse shortcuts that allow us to do things like quick zooms, etc. But speaking of zoom, you'll note on the right side of the status bar we have this guy here. This allows us to drag and drop, or we can click the plus and minus buttons to zoom in or zoom out. Sometimes you may want to do edits on many objects on a drawing page. In that case, zooming out big time is going to be what you want to do. Other times you're doing very fine, close-in, detailed work. You can adjust the zoom very quickly that way. You note that you get the current zoom level to the left of the zoom slider. You can actually click that zoom level button to bring up the zoom dialog box, and this has some really interesting presets including actual size, page width, whole page, or a custom percentage. I'm going to choose whole page for a second, and then we'll come over two more buttons to this guy that looks like a magnifying glass. This is the pan and zoom window. You can click it repeatedly to toggle pan and zoom on or off. This is especially helpful when you have very busy and detailed Visio drawings and it's hard to just zoom normally to get from one side of the drawing to the other. When the pan and zoom window is out, you can click and drag in the pan and zoom window to create this little selection rectangle, and you'll notice what's happened. The border of your selection rectangle is going to determine what you see in the main drawing window. So I could be doing some fine work, maybe lining up this particular line better with category ID, and then I want to check another junction. I can just move the pan and zoom slider over here. It looks like I have a problem. Let me fix that. There we go. Now we can move over here. So it allows you to get really close in while at the same time maintaining a nice bird's eye perspective of your drawing. Pan and zoom is one of my favorite panels. Something that's new in Visio 2010 that I like a lot is this guy that's between pan and zoom and your zoom slider. This you'll be using a lot too, I think. It's fit page to current window. So you could be zoomed in several 100%, and if you just want to quickly get back to full page view, that button will work. Finally, you notice the switch windows. We only have one diagram open right now, but this can be a very quick way if you have multiple Visio files open at once to go from one to the other. The alternative is to come to the View tab, switch windows. That is a few mouse clicks, and it's kind of a pain in the rear end as far as I'm personally concerned. I like this guy down here. You just have to get into into the habit of remembering that the button's there. In the lower left corner of the status bar, we have just basic information. This is data about your file, or as we call it, metadata. Page 1 of 2 gives us the page number. Language gives us the system language that is in use. If we're going to do macros, this invokes the macro recorder. We can right-click an empty area of the status bar to customize what we see. If we know we're not going to use macros, we can turn off the macro recorder option. We can give ourselves options for more information by turning off language if we know we're always going to be using, say, English US. All of the other stuff is still visible: width, height, length, angle. You might be asking, well, Tim, I don't see that information on the page. The reason is that those options are context sensitive. If I select a shape in my drawing, like TBL categories, you'll notice we can instantly see width, height, angle, etc. And if you give that a click, you actually bring out another pane called size and position, where you can specify very, very granularly and accurately the dimensionality of a selected shape. Basically, you have a live drawing surface where most everything is clickable. Really great way to do business. Let me select these shapes over on the pasteboard and press delete to get rid of them. And let's briefly touch on exporting to different file types. Now, if we do a file save as I showed you earlier when we created that template, you can choose a location for your Visio drawing file, and then to save it as a different file type is as easy as choosing in the Save as Type dropdown one other selection. You see we have a tremendous amount of flexibility here. The top option is the native Visio format. The web drawing or VDW file we'll discuss later in the course. This deals with files that will be published to the web and renderable in a web browser. Stencil files we talked about, templates we talked about. XML, and specifically the VDX format, is a way to make your Visio drawing platform agnostic, such that a user using a non-Visio application would have a better chance of rendering your file and editing your file if they don't have Visio but have, say, a competitor of Visio. The good news is that current versions of OmniGraffle, for instance, which is available on just about all OS platforms, will read native VSD files, but VDX uses the extensible markup language's ability to be vendor neutral and generalizes your file, whereas at the same time keeping your shape data. You're going to learn as we go along, a Visio drawing is far more than just a collection of shapes on the page. Once you get into data-driven Visio diagrams and shapes that have a lot of information associated with them, you're going to want to keep that information when you export your file. And in most cases, sadly, the metadata is not going to go along for the ride. You notice that we can export to a scalable vector graphics file, SVG. This is a really nice image format that does use vectors, and it's part of the HTML5 specification. So we have lots of options. You can save directly as GIF or JPEG. Let me do that really quickly. I'm going to save this to the desktop as nuggetlaberd.jpg. It's a nice way to save a Visio file in a very, very platform agnostic way. A user could look at a JPEG on any device under the sun, even a mobile device. So let me double left click the JPG file, and sure, it looks beautiful. It's the current page. Of course, any embedded metadata that we have with the shapes is not going to be visible. Any code, macros, links, etc. aren't coming along. But if for no other reason you need to share the raw materials of the file, at least the shape outlines of the file, this is a really quick way to do that, to share that with folks. Another way to get to export options besides Save As is the Save and Send item from the Backstage view. You'll see here we have several options for email. You can save a copy of the drawing as an email attachment. Of course, the recipient is going to need to have Visio, or at least the Visio viewer, installed on their system. Save as SharePoint integrates with SharePoint services. We're going to need a web drawing type for that, and you notice we have a nice shortcut way to save web drawings from this interface. Change file type is just another way of looking at the Save As dropdown. This is kind of the old school way to export to a different file format. The new motif is to simply do Save and Send from Backstage, change file type, and you have access to at least the most common drawing types: XML, VDX, JPEG as we saw earlier, VST for template, VDW for web drawing, etc. Now, create PDF or XPS. What does that mean? Well, PDF is Adobe Acrobat's portable document format, a pretty ubiquitous form, really nice way to save a multi-page Visio drawing as a document that users can see all of your pages with full fidelity. As this says here, preserves fonts, formattings, and images. The downside to this, like most of the export formats actually, is that the content cannot be easily changed, certainly not with native Visio tools. XPS is Microsoft's competitor to PDF. I don't think it has anywhere near in fact I know that XPS doesn't have the market penetration that PDF does, but Microsoft still seems to be hanging on to the XPS format. You can view XPS files using current versions of Internet Explorer. Speaking of which, that's our final part of this demo. You can share Visio drawings with folks who do not have Visio. The only requirement on their end is they need to have a fairly recent version of Internet Explorer. Well, let me scratch that, because as you see, I'm at the Microsoft Download Center, Visio 2010 Visio Viewer download link, and it tells us here that we can render just about any version of Visio from version 5, which is like prehistoric, through Visio 2010 in Internet Explorer version 5 through 8. Now that's pretty interesting. Version 5 goes back many, many years, so it's nice that we have flexibility in this regard. Again, Microsoft URLs are pretty complex, so I would recommend you just do a search engine search for Visio 2010 Viewer. That'll take you to this page. It's a 16 megabyte download, and what it is, it's an ActiveX control that plugs into your web browser. Let me run the installer right here. I've downloaded it already. I'm going to right-click, close my browser before I do this. I'll accept the license terms, click Continue. Installs the viewer. Doesn't take long at all. I've switched over to another system and installed the Visio Viewer, so we can test this out. Let me pop open Internet Explorer. We can drag the VSD file directly into Internet Explorer. We get a banner here that gives us a security warning. Are we sure we want to run the ActiveX control that we just installed? I'm going to open this up, left click it, choose Allow Blocked Content. Security is a good thing. And then here is the Visio file rendered in Internet Explorer. Shows up with great fidelity, as you see. We see not only the foreground page, but also our background page, interestingly enough. And on the toolbar, we can zoom in, we can zoom out, we can zoom to page, we can zoom to width, we can set a custom zoom level, open in Microsoft Visio. If we have Visio installed on the system, we can open a copy. First button that I bypassed is just an About dialog. And then finally, we have Properties and Settings. Again, this is a read-only view. We can customize what we're seeing. If we have layers, we can selectively show or hide layers. We'll talk about layers later in the course. It's nice that Microsoft gives us that ability. There's actually a separate button for customizing layer settings. Markup settings, same thing really. Properties and Settings does both of these buttons' actions in a single interface, and then there's Help. So there it is, using the Visio Viewer ActiveX control plugin for Internet Explorer. Finally, there's a website you should be aware of called wssdemo.com. This is a demonstration site that's meant to give you some experience with SharePoint Server. Now, originally the site owner here, Ian Morish, devoted himself to SharePoint Services 3, WSS, and Microsoft Office SharePoint Server 2007. I like that they've updated the site to 2010. In this particular page, it's under the top level of the site, under Pages, Visio.aspx, demonstrates using Visio services in SharePoint. We have a web part, or an embedded web page element, that gives you the same idea that we just saw, the zoomability. All of your Visio Viewer controls are here. And again, this is a multi-page interface. We're sharing the entire Visio book. And a little bit lower on the page, this shows just a native Visio services control. So we're going to learn how to do this later in the course, but this is the ultimate, the ability to just have your Visio pages preloaded in a web page where a user doesn't have to do anything but just simply load the web page. Good stuff. Touring the Visio 2010 interface review. At this point, you understand how to open Visio and navigate its user interface. You understand in great detail what the backstage view is, as well as how to navigate the ribbon controls to get done the work that we're going to be getting done over the course of this training series. We also have a good understanding of the various and sundry file types that comprise Visio drawings and templates, and we understand how stencil files work and how stencils and shapes fit into Visio templates. Finally, we have a really good grasp on how to save Visio drawings, that is to say native Visio drawings, as alternate file types, as well as being able to render our Visio drawings in a web browser. This is going to give us great return on investment when it comes time to share our work with other users who, again, may not have Visio installed on their computers. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.